It started like any other day in Florida. The sun was high in the sky, casting its warm, golden glow over the state. A light breeze rustled through the palm trees, carrying the sweet scent of salt water and tropical flowers. People were out and about, enjoying the sunshine and the slow-paced life Florida was famous for. The beaches were filled with vacationers, locals lounging in the sand, kids playing in the surf, and the occasional surfer chasing the perfect wave. It was one of those days that made you believe life couldn't be any better. Florida was as it always had been, a little laid-back paradise where nothing ever really went wrong. But as the day wore on, there was something strange in the air, a quiet tension that no one could put their finger on. Behind the facade of perfect beach days and carefree vacations, something was brewing. No one knew it yet, but the calm was about to be shattered. The first reports came in from the Everglades, that vast, swampy stretch of land in the southern part of the state. In the beginning, it seemed insignificant. Just a few isolated cases of people coming down with a strange illness. At first, there were no real concerns. It was just a few tourists who had visited the Everglades, reporting mild symptoms: fever, chills, nausea, and an aching body. It sounded like a typical flu or food poisoning. Nothing to raise any alarms. The hospitals took in the sick, treated them with the usual medications, and life continued. The tourists were sent back to their hotels, and the staff at the Everglades thought it would blow over in a few days. But it didn't. Within hours, the cases began to grow. More people, mostly visitors to the region, reported the same symptoms. And soon, the locals were affected as well. At first, no one suspected anything unusual. It was still flu season, after all. But then, the symptoms began to take a more disturbing turn. It started with the way the infected acted. It wasn't just the fever or the pale skin. It was the way they moved. Those who had been sick seemed to become disconnected. Their eyes lost focus, and they began to behave erratically, almost like they were in a trance. It wasn't the usual lethargy of a bad flu. These people were visibly agitated. They twitched, they hissed, and their faces, something wasn't right about their faces. They weren't the same people anymore. It wasn't long before the violence began. It happened on a quiet evening in Key West, one of Florida's most popular tourist destinations. A man, a tourist who had been visiting from the Midwest, had spent the day exploring the island. He'd checked in at his hotel, eaten dinner at one of the local seafood restaurants, and walked down the streets with his camera, snapping photos of the sights. He was on vacation, like thousands of others. Life seemed perfect, but everything was about to change. No one knows exactly what triggered it. Maybe it was the heat. Maybe it was the stress. Maybe it was the infection coursing through his veins. But suddenly, this man snapped. Without warning, he lunged at a local shopkeeper, biting down hard on his arm. The man screamed, trying to push him off, but the tourist wasn't letting go. His grip tightened like a vice. It wasn't just the pain that was terrifying. It was the look in his eyes. He wasn't fighting to get free. He wasn't acting out of self-defense. It was like he was completely lost in some primal animalistic rage. The shopkeeper managed to break free, but the damage had been done. The bite was deep, and the infection was spreading. Within hours, the shopkeeper began to feel the first signs. His body temperature shot up, his muscles tightened, and his skin took on an unnatural pallor. But it wasn't just the illness that was strange. It was the way he started to act. The once kind man, who had greeted customers with a smile, now wandered aimlessly through his shop, muttering to himself in a language no one understood. His eyes were wild, unfocused, and the worst part, he seemed hungry. That night, Key West fell into chaos. Word spread quickly that something was wrong, but no one knew what it was. By the time authorities started arriving, it was too late. The first bite had set off a chain reaction. People who had been bitten or scratched by the infected started showing the same symptoms. At first, it was subtle, just strange behavior and strange movements. But then it escalated into violent outbursts. The infected didn't just attack, they tore into anyone in sight, showing a brutal, savage aggression that no one had ever seen before. It wasn't long before the panic spread. Within a matter of hours, locals and tourists alike began to flee the island. But it was too late. The infection spread like wildfire. People began barricading themselves in their homes, and the few remaining survivors were desperate to get away from the madness. But no one could escape fast enough. And then something even stranger happened. The infected didn't just stop at attacking people. They were different from the stories we know of in movies and books. They didn't stumble or moan aimlessly. They were faster, stronger. Their movements were erratic, unpredictable, and they hunted in packs. By the time the local authorities began to understand what was going on, it was too late. The first few incidents had been brushed off as a freak accident, an isolated event. But now it was clear this was something much worse. Something that had spread beyond Key West. Something that was starting to reach other parts of Florida. And yet, the rest of the country had no idea. To them, Florida was still the vacation paradise it always had been. News outlets mentioned the strange cases of illness, but attributed it to some mysterious flu or bacterial outbreak. They assured the public that there was no need to panic. But those who were in Florida, the ones who saw the horror firsthand, knew the truth. They were living through something no one could comprehend. The panic hadn't fully set in yet. Not outside of Florida, anyway. People still went about their days, not realizing they were only a few days away from the start of a nationwide nightmare. It wasn't until the first wave of attacks reached the mainland that the rest of the world began to understand. By then, it was already too late. The storm had already begun, and nothing could stop it. The sun was setting on the perfect paradise of Florida. And what lay ahead was something much darker. The calm before the storm had lasted just long enough for everyone to believe it would be a normal day. But the nightmare had already begun. By nightfall, chaos had already begun to take over the peaceful paradise that was Florida. What had started as a few strange reports of illness and bizarre behavior in the Everglades had quickly spread throughout the state, transforming it into a nightmare no one was prepared for. The air, which had been warm and inviting earlier in the day, now felt thick with unease. The Sunshine State was slowly being devoured by something far darker than anyone could have ever imagined. The virus, whatever it was, had begun spreading at an alarming rate, and its effects were like nothing anyone had ever seen before. People were changing, not in the way of a simple illness or flu. No, these people were becoming something else entirely, something monstrous. It started with strange behaviors. At first, those who had been infected were simply not themselves. Their eyes, once vibrant and full of life, became dull and glazed over. They moved erratically, almost in jerky motions, their bodies no longer responding to their minds the way they should. But soon, the transformation took a more sinister turn. As the night crept in, more and more people were succumbing to whatever had taken hold of them. They stopped speaking, or when they did, it was only in guttural growls and grunts. Their movements became more aggressive, as if they were driven by something primal, something that couldn't be reasoned with or stopped. And then the attacks started. It was not just a disease anymore. These people, these things, were attacking others, and not in the way someone might expect. There was no hesitation, no remorse in their actions. They would lunge at anyone within reach, sinking their teeth into the flesh of the living with terrifying strength, tearing skin and ripping through veins. It wasn't just a bite. It was destruction. The violence spread through Florida like a wildfire, unstoppable and merciless. In the midst of this escalating madness, a group of friends found themselves trapped at a beach party near Miami. They had arrived earlier that day, excited to soak up the sun and enjoy their weekend away. They had no idea that the world they knew was quickly slipping away. As the sun began to set, they noticed something wasn't right. People who had been laughing and dancing were suddenly acting strange. They moved in odd, unnatural ways. At first, the group thought maybe it was just the alcohol, the late-night fatigue catching up with the crowd. But then they saw it. One of the partygoers, someone they had been talking to just hours before, lunged at another friend, biting down on his shoulder with a ferocity that seemed almost animalistic. It was a moment of pure horror. The scene that followed happened in mere seconds, but it felt like an eternity. bitten friend screamed, the sound sharp and piercing, cutting through the music and the laughter. His face twisted in agony as he tried to push the attacker off. But the assailant was stronger than anyone could have imagined. The other partygoers didn't know what to do. Some screamed, others froze in place, too stunned to react. The infected partygoer didn't stop. He didn't even seem to acknowledge that there was anything wrong with what he was doing. He just kept biting, gnawing, tearing into the helpless victim until the poor man was left limp and lifeless. In the blink of an eye, the festive atmosphere of the party turned into pure chaos. Panic spread like wildfire. The group of friends who had been joking and laughing just moments earlier realized they had to act. They scrambled for any possible means of escape, running for their cars, looking for a way out of the beach area. But they soon found that the beach, usually open and spacious, was now overrun with people. People who had turned. Those who had been infected were now full-fledged monsters. Their once human forms were twisted into something far worse. Their skin was pale, almost sickly. Their eyes bloodshot and wide with hunger. Flesh hung from their bodies, torn and shredded from earlier attacks, and their movements were no longer slow and stumbling. No, these creatures were fast. They could chase you down. They could catch you. The friends had no time to think. They ran, weaving through the crowds of panicked people, desperately trying to get to their cars. But as they turned a corner, they found themselves face to face with a group of the infected. The creatures growled low in their throats. Their pale, rotten faces contorted into grotesque snarls. One of the friends, a young woman named Lisa, screamed as one of the creatures lunged at her, its mouth open wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. It was too late to move. She was grabbed by the arms, pulled toward the infected man. He sunk his teeth into her arm with a sickening crack, and her scream was drowned out by the sound of flesh being torn. The others tried to fight back, but it was hopeless. The creatures were too strong, too relentless. One by one, they were overwhelmed. The panic, the fear, the horror, it all became a blur. They were running from their worst nightmare, and no matter how fast they ran, no matter how many turns they took, it felt like they were trapped. Every time they thought they had made it to safety, another wave of zombies would emerge from the shadows, hungry for their flesh. It was as if the night itself was alive, and it was feeding on their terror. Eventually, the group split up. Some tried to reach the cars. Others sought refuge in the buildings around the beach. But nothing was safe. The streets were a war zone. The night, which had started as a carefree evening, was now filled with the sounds of screams, groans and the sickening crunch of bones as the undead tore through anyone unlucky enough to cross their path. And as the hours dragged on, the situation only grew worse. The infection spread faster than anyone could anticipate. As the first night of this horrific outbreak came to a close, it became clear this wasn't just a local incident. This was the beginning of something much larger. Something that was going to consume the entire state and possibly the entire nation. The friends who had been out at the party that night were the lucky ones. They had made it out alive, but they had seen the horrors that were now spreading like wildfire across Florida. They were living through the nightmare that would soon become a nationwide crisis. And by the time the rest of the world realized what was happening, it would be too late. The groans of the undead echoed through the streets, and the once beautiful beaches of Florida became a scene of unspeakable horror. The night was only the beginning. What awaited the survivors was far worse than anything they could have imagined. The first taste of the nightmare had only just begun, and no one knew how or when it would end. The dead were rising, and there was no escaping them. The Everglades, a vast, mysterious swamp in southern Florida, was once a serene, untouched expanse of wild beauty. Its dense, moss-draped trees and quiet, winding waterways made it a sanctuary for wildlife and a haven for those seeking peace away from the hustle and bustle of city life. Small towns dotted the outskirts, tucked away from the main roads, surrounded by miles of thick vegetation. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down and people could escape the noise of the world. But when the outbreak began, it turned into something much darker. A place of terror. A place that would come to be known as Ground Zero for the zombie apocalypse. As the infection spread across Florida, the Everglades became a hiding place for the infected. The thick, murky waters and endless miles of swampy terrain provided the perfect cover for those trying to escape the chaos of the cities. But there was no true escape. The disease was spreading fast, and the wilds of the Everglades were not the safe refuge many had hoped for. The infection was relentless, and it quickly began to take hold in the secluded cabins and small towns that dotted the area. The first signs were subtle. People who had lived in these small towns for years began to show strange symptoms. Mild fever, a sense of delirium, and an unexplainable urge to wander. At first, the locals thought it was just a flu or some bug that had gotten passed around. But soon, those who had fallen ill began to change in ways that defied logic. Their eyes turned glassy, and their skin began to take on a sickly pallor. Their movements became jerky, and their bodies seemed to lose all coordination. A small family living in one of the cabins was the first to experience the true horror. The father, who had been infected, attacked his wife and children without warning. His strength was unnatural, almost inhuman. He overpowered his wife easily, biting into her neck with a savage hunger that made her scream in agony. The children tried to run, but they were no match for the infected father. One by one, they fell victim to the growing madness. The man didn't stop at just killing them. He tore into their bodies with terrifying brutality, ripping them apart as if they were nothing more than prey. It was a gruesome scene, a scene that would become all too familiar in the days to come. News of the massacre spread quickly. The small towns near the Everglades were being overrun, and the authorities, who had been slow to react, were caught off guard. They had no idea how to handle the situation. The virus was spreading too fast, and it was clear that this wasn't just some flu or outbreak. It was something far worse. The media, scrambling to make sense of the situation, began showing footage of what was happening in the Everglades. But nothing could prepare the public for the horrors they were about to see. In one of the towns closest to the Everglades, a local news crew ventured into the area to investigate. They captured footage of what they described as the aftermath of a massacre. The camera panned over what had once been a quiet suburban neighborhood, now completely destroyed. Homes were abandoned, doors ripped off their hinges, and windows shattered. The ground was covered in blood, and the remnants of once innocent families lay scattered across the streets. What was left of them was unrecognizable. The bodies of mothers, fathers, and children had been torn apart, their flesh ripped from their bones with terrifying force. The infected were everywhere, wandering the streets in search of more victims. The footage showed entire families turned into zombies, their once warm and loving faces now twisted with an insatiable hunger. These weren't the mindless, slow-moving zombies people had heard about in stories and movies. No, these were fast, vicious creatures, driven purely by the need to feed. They attacked without hesitation, tearing apart anything that moved. The strength they displayed was unnatural, and the horror they caused was beyond comprehension. It was a massacre. There was no other word for it. As the situation grew worse, the survivors who managed to escape shared their terrifying stories. Those who had lived in the Everglades or nearby towns spoke of watching their loved ones transform before their very eyes. People who had once been their neighbors, their friends, their families, were now unrecognizable. They wandered aimlessly through the streets, eyes glazed over with hunger, gnashing their teeth, and attacking anyone who came too close. The survivors were forced to flee, leaving behind everything they had known in a desperate bid for survival. One survivor, a man in his mid-30s, recounted the horrors he had witnessed. He spoke of how his brother had been the first to change. They had been out hunting in the swamp when his brother began to show signs of illness. At first, They thought it was just a fever from being out in the heat too long. But as the days passed, his brother's condition worsened. His skin grew pale, and his eyes became sunken. He began to behave strangely, stumbling around as though he didn't recognize anyone. And then, one night, he attacked. The man's voice shook as he described what happened next. His brother had lunged at him, his eyes wild with rage, and sank his teeth into his shoulder. It wasn't just a bite. It was like something out of a nightmare. The strength his brother exhibited was terrifying. He couldn't fight him off. The only thing that saved him was the fire they had built. In a panic, he had pushed his brother into the flames, hoping to stop the attack. It worked. His brother was burned alive, but not before he had witnessed the transformation firsthand. His brother, the man he had grown up with, was gone. In his place was something else, something hungry, something dead. For the survivors, it was impossible to comprehend the scale of the horror. What had started as a small outbreak in the Everglades had now spiraled out of control, and the small towns nearby were ground zero for the massacre. No one was safe. It didn't matter if you were a child or an adult, a local or a tourist. The infected attacked indiscriminately. There was no mercy. The once peaceful area that had been home to families and nature lovers was now a war zone. A place where only the strong survived. As the days passed, the infection spread beyond the Everglades, leaving a trail of death in its wake. The small towns near the swamp, once full of life and laughter, were now nothing more than ghost towns. The survivors, who managed to escape, didn't have time to mourn. They didn't have time to process what had happened. All they could think about was survival and the constant fear that the zombies were coming for them next. And as the infection continued to spread, no one knew what to expect next. The world outside of Florida still hadn't fully grasped the magnitude of the situation. The news reports showed only a fraction of the chaos, leaving the rest of the world blind to the horror unfolding in the Everglades. But for those who had survived, the truth was clear. What they had witnessed was just the beginning. The worst was yet to come. The Everglades Massacre was only the first chapter in a nightmare that would soon engulf the entire nation. As the infection continued to spread across Florida, it didn't take long for the situation to spiral out of control. What began as isolated incidents in small towns quickly turned into a full-blown disaster. The virus, which had already turned the Everglades into a nightmare, was now creeping northward, infecting the cities. Florida was the first state to fall victim to the outbreak, but it wouldn't be the last. By the time the infection reached major cities like Orlando and Tampa, it was too late for the authorities to act. The virus moved quickly, and the death toll mounted rapidly. Orlando, a city known for its theme parks and bustling tourist life, was one of the first to be overwhelmed. In just a matter of days, the once vibrant city had turned into a war zone. People ran through the streets, desperately trying to escape, but the undead were everywhere. The infected had spread like wildfire, tearing through the city with alarming speed. The military was deployed to contain the outbreak, but it was clear that they were outmatched. The soldiers, armed with rifles and high-tech weaponry, were no match for the sheer force and relentless nature of the zombies. Their tactics were ineffective, and their numbers were dwindling as the infection spread further. The soldiers tried their best to hold the line, but every corner of the city seemed to be overrun with the undead. It was as though the virus had a mind of its own, and it was intent on spreading to every corner of. By the time the virus reached Tampa, Florida was in full lockdown. The state had declared martial law in a desperate attempt to control the chaos, but the damage had already been done. What had once been a bustling metropolis was now a ghost town, its streets empty except for the occasional desperate survivor or the terrifying shuffle of the undead. People were barricading themselves in their homes, hoping against hope that they would be spared from the horrors lurking just outside their doors. The government's efforts to contain the outbreak were in vain. It was clear to anyone paying attention that the situation was beyond saving. Florida had already fallen, and now the rest of the country was watching, waiting to see if they would be next. News stations across the country began airing live broadcasts of the devastation unfolding in Florida. People from all over the United States tuned in to witness the horror. Their screens filled with images of Florida's decimated towns. What had once been an idyllic paradise was now a war zone. A place where survival was the only thing that mattered. The cameras captured the chaos in real time, the bodies of the infected littering the streets, their bloodied faces twisted in hunger. They filmed the survivors who were holed up in buildings, desperately trying to fend off the endless waves of zombies. The survivors were barricading themselves in anything they could find, stores, office buildings, even abandoned homes, hoping to survive just one more night. The rest of the world was watching in shock as the disaster in Florida unfolded before their eyes. As the images of Florida's destruction played on every news channel, the panic began to spread across the nation. People in other states started to fear that the same fate would befall them. Emergency preparedness plans were put into action as cities began to reinforce their borders. National Guard units were deployed to other states, just in case the outbreak made its way to their doorsteps. Panic buying of supplies became a nationwide phenomenon. Shelves were cleared of food, water, and medical supplies as people scrambled to prepare for the worst. Yet no matter how much they stocked up, it seemed like nothing could prepare them for the true horror that had taken hold in Florida. The CDC, who had initially downplayed the seriousness of the outbreak, finally came forward with the grim news. The virus, they confirmed, spread through bites, and in some cases, through contact with infected blood. The disease was transmitted rapidly, and once someone was bitten or exposed, the symptoms manifested almost immediately. The infected didn't just get sick, they turned into something else entirely. Their bodies decayed at a terrifying rate, their skin becoming pale and mottled, their eyes turning a sickly yellow. But it wasn't just the physical transformation that made the infected so dangerous. They were faster, stronger, and far more aggressive than anyone could have imagined. What had once been a man or woman was now a creature driven by a primal hunger for human flesh. The CDC also confirmed that the virus had no known cure. They were doing everything they could to study the virus, but they had no answers. There was no vaccine, no treatment. The world was in the dark, scrambling for answers, but it was clear the nightmare that had begun in the Everglades was now a national crisis, and no one knew how to stop it. As the days turned into weeks, the situation only worsened. The virus didn't stop at Florida's borders. It spread to nearby states, and soon news outlets reported that the infection was making its way up the East Coast. Cities like Savannah, Charleston, and even parts of Georgia began to report outbreaks. The government, once hopeful that they could contain the virus, now realized the extent of the disaster. The national response was sluggish, disjointed, and far too late. The country, still reeling from the horror in Florida, was now bracing for what was to come. The authorities, unable to control the spread, began recommending that people abandon urban areas and seek refuge in more remote locations. But it was clear that no one was truly safe anymore. Throughout the chaos, the American public watched helplessly from their homes. The constant updates from the news only made them feel more helpless. The military was doing everything it could, but the sheer scale of the disaster was too much for them to handle. Some people tried to leave their homes and escape to the country, but the roads were filled with gridlocked cars, many abandoned by those who had been attacked or turned into zombies. Others, in a desperate attempt to survive, fortified their homes, creating makeshift bunkers out of furniture and anything else they could find. But no matter how hard they tried to hide, the undead were relentless. In a final, desperate attempt to contain the outbreak, the government attempted to quarantine entire regions, but the strategy was futile. The zombies had already spread too far, and the infection had become a nationwide pandemic. People began to lose hope. The once beautiful country was now a place of death and despair, where the living and the dead fought for survival in a world that seemed to be falling apart. The horror that had started in Florida had now become a national tragedy, and As the government struggled to maintain control, the people of the United States were left wondering how long they could survive in a world where the dead walked among them and the living were left to fend for themselves. As Florida's major cities fell, the state became an unrecognizable wasteland. What had once been a thriving, bustling area was now reduced to a desolate landscape, marked only by the lingering screams of the undead and the desperate shouts of the few survivors left. Major cities like Orlando, Tampa, and Jacksonville had been overrun, their streets filled with the relentless tide of zombies that had once been human. The government had lost control, and with each passing day, the situation grew worse. In the chaos that followed, only a few pockets of survivors remained, scattered across the state, clinging to the last remnants of life. For those who hadn't turned into zombies, survival was a constant battle. The world they once knew had collapsed, leaving them to fight not only the undead, but also each other. Resources were scarce. Food, water, medical supplies, all of it had become precious and fleeting. What had once been easy to come by was now a commodity that people were willing to kill for. Safe places were even rarer, with the majority of shelters already overrun. Those who still had the will to fight were constantly on the move, hoping for a place that hadn't already fallen to the infection. In the heart of downtown Miami, one of the last remaining safe zones stood. A high-rise building surrounded by barricades, offering a temporary reprieve from the horrors outside. The survivors who gathered there were some of the fortunate ones. They had found refuge in a building that still held its ground against the onslaught of zombies that prowled the streets below. The building's upper floors had been fortified as best as they could, with a few survivors stationed at the windows, keeping watch for any signs of danger. It wasn't much, but it was enough to hold on for a while longer. But even in this temporary haven, a sense of unease began to settle among the survivors. Every creak of the building, every strange noise from below sent a ripple of fear through the group. They knew that their safety was fragile, that it was only a matter of time before the zombies found a way in. But what they didn't expect was that their biggest threat wouldn't come from the infected, but from within the group itself. As days turned into weeks, tensions began to rise among the survivors. People who had once been neighbors, co-workers, or friends now found themselves at odds, each person scrambling to secure whatever resources they could find. Supplies were running low, and there wasn't enough to go around. The shared sense of desperation and fear soon led to distrust. Everyone was on edge. Food and water were rationed, but not everyone was satisfied with the amounts they received. Arguments broke out over the smallest of things. Who should get the last bottle of water? Who should take the next shift guarding the entrance? As the walls of the building felt more and more like a prison, the cracks began to show. Those who had once shared meals and conversation now saw each other as potential threats, each person more concerned with their own survival than the well-being of the group. The sense of unity that had been there at the start of their refuge was slipping away, replaced by a bitter, gnawing distrust. People who had once worked together to make sure they stayed safe now turned on one another in a desperate scramble for resources. At first, it was small things. A whispered argument over who should take the watch during the night. A stolen can of beans from the supply shelf. But as time wore on, the fights grew more intense. People began sneaking off into the dark corners of the building, hoarding food or water, not willing to share with the others. In a world where survival was the only thing that mattered, kindness and cooperation became luxuries. And as the survivors grew more desperate, they became willing to do whatever it took to stay alive, no matter who they had to hurt in the process. But the zombies weren't the only problem facing the survivors. As they huddled together in the high-rise, fighting to hold on to the little they had left, one of the survivors noticed something horrifying, something that would change everything. At first, it seemed like a random occurrence, a strange coincidence. The zombies had always been slow, mindless creatures, drawn only by the scent of human flesh. But something was different now. They weren't just attacking randomly anymore. They were moving with a purpose. They were learning. It started with the way they approached the building. At first, the zombies would stumble aimlessly, banging on the doors and windows in an attempt to get inside. But now, they were more coordinated. They were working together, trying different strategies to break through the barricades. The survivors first noticed it when one group of zombies began to gather near a fire escape ladder. They weren't just aimlessly wandering around. They were watching, waiting, and acting in unison. The zombies on the lower floors were no longer simply scratching at the doors. They were trying to break through them, pushing against the barricades with an eerie, synchronized determination. It was almost like they had learned what worked and what didn't. At first, the survivors dismissed it as a fluke. Maybe the zombies were just reacting to the sounds of movement inside the building. But it didn't stop there. The next day, they noticed something else. The zombies were no longer just attacking the first person they saw. They were learning to target the weak points of their defenses. One survivor, who had been assigned to guard the roof access door, noticed that the zombies had begun to gather at the back of the building. They weren't just looking for food. They were planning, coordinating their movements, as if they understood the layout of the building. They had learned that the front door was too heavily guarded, so they had started testing other entrances. The survivors had once thought they were safe, but now they realized that the zombies were adapting. They were evolving, and that made them even more dangerous. Panic spread among the group as they realized the full extent of the threat. The infected weren't just mindless creatures. They were becoming smarter, more organized. The survivors had no way of knowing just how far this evolution would go, or how long they could hold out before the zombies found a way in. And worse yet, they had no idea how long they could survive if the tension between them continued to escalate. Trust was gone. The survivors were now more likely to turn on each other than to help one another. In a world where humanity's worst impulses were laid bare, survival meant becoming as ruthless as the monsters they were fighting. The fight for survival had become a battle on two fronts, against the undead and against the very people they were supposed to trust. And as the days dragged on, it became clear that both battles would be fought to the bitter end. The survivors had held out for weeks, watching from their rooftop in Miami as the world around them crumbled. They had been through so much already, losing friends, witnessing the transformation of their loved ones into mindless, violent creatures, and struggling to survive in a world that had turned into a nightmare. But as they stood on that rooftop, a sense of dread settled over them like a heavy fog. The zombies, those mindless monsters that had plagued them for so long, had finally figured it out. They had learned. They had adapted. And now they were breaking into the high-rise. At first, the survivors had been confident. They had fortified the building as best as they could, reinforcing the doors and windows, sealing off every possible entrance. They thought they had found a safe haven, a place where they could hold out until the world outside either collapsed entirely or a miracle came to save them. But it was becoming painfully clear that the undead were not just mindless creatures anymore. They had learned to work together, to strategize, to find new ways to break in. They had no hope of escape, no backup, no reinforcements coming to save them. They were on their own. It had started with the pounding. First, it was faint, a distant thudding that barely registered in their tired minds. They thought it was just another wave of the infected, trying to get through the barricades. But then it grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just random banging. The zombies were coordinating, trying to break through the weaker parts of their defenses. They had figured out that the fire escape was unlocked, that the windows on the lower levels were not as secure as they should have been. The survivors could hear the sounds of the undead below, moving in packs, their guttural growls mixing with the sound of metal scraping against concrete. They were getting in. A heavy silence fell over the survivors as they watched the hordes of zombies grow closer. Panic swept through them. It was one thing to know that the undead were outside, waiting for the chance to get in. But to realize that the walls they had so carefully constructed were no longer enough to keep them safe. It was a cold, terrifying revelation. There were only a handful of them left now. Those who had survived the initial chaos were either dead, lost to the infected, or had simply given up in despair. Now only the strongest remained, standing on that rooftop, ready to face the final wave of the undead. A decision was made quickly, almost instinctively. They had no choice but to make one last stand. It was a desperate, hopeless decision, but it was the only one they could make. The survivors gathered what little weapons they could find: pipes, broken glass, shards of metal, and anything that could serve as a makeshift weapon. They formed a circle, watching each other's backs, as they prepared for the onslaught that was sure to come. The first wave hit hard. The survivors fought with everything they had, using the tools they had scavenged to fend off the zombies that poured into the building. It was a brutal battle. They fought in close quarters, swinging their makeshift weapons at the undead with all their strength. Their faces twisted in terror and determination. Blood and sweat mixed together as they hacked at the zombies, desperately trying to keep them away. The zombies kept coming, their numbers swelling with each passing moment. For every one they took down, another seemed to take its place. They had learned. They were relentless, smarter, and stronger than ever before. The survivors had already seen too many of their own fall, but now it was becoming impossible to keep up. The barricades they had set up around the building began to fail. Doors were ripped off their hinges, windows were shattered, and the walls that had once kept them safe were crumbling. The survivors fought harder, but their strength was fading. The hope they had once clung to was slipping through their fingers like sand. They were running out of options, and fast. The air was thick with the stench of blood and decay. The groans of the undead grew louder, closer. Each breath they took felt like it could be their last. They knew they couldn't hold out forever, but still, they fought. They fought because it was all they had left. They fought because to give up was to accept defeat. And that was something none of them could do. Not after everything they had been through. The final wave came like a flood. The zombies poured into the building, overwhelming the survivors who were already exhausted from the battle. One by one, the barricades broke down. The walls, once strong, were no match for the relentless undead. The survivors were pushed back, cornered in the small, overcrowded rooms of the high-rise. They knew it was over. There was no escape now. They had fought as hard as they could, but the zombies were too many. Beneath. And then, as the last few survivors realized that their time had come, they made the decision to fight to the end. They would not go quietly into the night. They would face the monsters that had destroyed their world head-on, without hesitation, without fear. It wasn't the way they had wanted it to end, but it was the only way they could ensure that they wouldn't become one of the undead. They made their peace with the inevitable, their final breaths filled with resolve. They fought even as the zombies closed in on them, each of them taking down as many as they could before they were consumed. In the end, the high-rise, once a sanctuary, fell silent. The survivors were gone, swallowed up by the never-ending tide of the undead. The world outside remained a wasteland. The remnants of the once thriving cities of Florida, now nothing more than abandoned husks, inhabited only by the creatures that had once been human. The rest of the nation was left to pick up the pieces, to figure out how to rebuild in a world that was now unrecognizable. As for the outbreak, no one knew exactly how it ended. The survivors had been the last bastion of hope, and with their fall, the rest of the country was left wondering what had happened to the virus. Was it contained, or did it continue to spread, moving beyond Florida's borders and reaching other states? Some people believe the virus had burned itself out, its effects fading as the infected either perished or were destroyed. Others thought that Florida had been abandoned entirely, left to rot as the world moved on. The truth was that no one really knew what happened next. All that was certain was that the zombie plague had left a permanent scar on the nation, a reminder of how quickly everything could fall apart. The question that lingered in the air was one that no one could answer. What if it happens again? Could humanity survive a second outbreak? Would the world be ready? They couldn't shake the nagging thought. What if the nightmare had only just begun?